great controversy here. It goes right to the heart of Alberta. And now going into Edmonton, so I'm speeding just so that we have time to get through the readings. Edmonton, my city, waves of immigration created it from the Cree migrating 10,000 years ago before they were Cree, all through the 20th century and the 21st. It's an extremely diverse province. The very first mosque ever built in North America was built in Edmonton, Arashid Mosque. African Americans started coming to our part of the country about 110 years ago as homesteaders, people taking First Nations land and developing their own farms. And so there's, in Alberta there were about 20 so-called black towns spread across the province, and more in Saskatchewan and in British Columbia. Heritage Days, my mother was one of the founders, was one of the great, in fact, the largest celebration of multiculturalism on the planet. A huge 3-day festival that attracts hundreds of thousands of people and has cultural displays for all the national organizations in the city. University of Alberta, the second or third, depending on the year you survey, largest campus in Canada, and an extremely multicultural student roster, which has led to the city becoming even more diverse. We're diverse in the arts. The second largest theater festival in the world, the Edmonton International Film Fringe Festival, is right there. One of the biggest improv comedy festivals right there in Edmonton. Classic sketch comedy shows, SCTV, its key years were shot right in Edmonton. So it's artistically great, it's culturally great, and in terms of the numerous African communities, so you had African Americans settling 110, 120 years ago during the 1940s. As the British Empire allegedly becomes the Commonwealth, you see great numbers of Afro-Caribbeans who arrive across Canada, especially Toronto, but also in Edmonton. And then in the 1960s, because of the University of Alberta, a lot of Kenyans, Tanzanians who arrived. In the 1980s, because of the famine, Ethiopians arrived. The collapse of the Somali state in the early 1990s leads to a great deal of Somalis and the ongoing Sudanese civil war that ultimately terminated in the creation of South Sudan as a country. So we have great waves of these, and that has created a neighborhood that in Edmonton I call Kush, which is the region of, typically called the Horn of Africa and slightly north. These ancient African civilizations, Egypt, Aksum, ancient Ethiopia, Meroe in Sudan, and pre-Meroe civilization. So that region of Edmonton is a cluster of those populations, and I began to notice this new cultural unit about 20 years ago, and when I said it needed a name, I started calling it Kush. I started to write about it. It showed up in my first book, The Coyote Kings. So there's some history. Afrofuturism, for those of you who might be new to the concept, is a subset of science fiction in which we see African peoples from various backgrounds. Primarily right now, it's African Americans, but there are Africans in various countries, Ghana, South Africa, Canada, elsewhere, who are creating science fiction in which African peoples appear not just as background and not just as very polite, smiling, friendly Geordie LaForge characters who could just as easily be serving cream of wheat with a little white hat on top. But characters who the stories appear from their perspective. Now, I don't call my work Afrofuturist. In fact, I hadn't heard of the term Afrofuturism until 2004 when the great writer Noah Hopkinson, who's another African-Canadian science fiction writer, blurred my book and referred to it as Afrofuturist. And I said, oh, that's an interesting term. I didn't know about it until then. I had been calling my work Imhotep-Hop. And the reason is that partly I was responding to the term cyberpunk. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the term cyberpunk. Cyberpunk quite obviously made a reference to technology, cybernetics, and also, by connection with the internet, and clearly the punk music and all the things that were part of punk music: hacking, do-it-yourself technology, culture jamming, all of that. Well, it's birthed steampunk, and then other forms of these punk subdivisions of science fiction. And now steampunk, reflecting 19th century reimagined colonial times and what would it be like with high technologies back then. But I call my work Imhotep-Hop for a variety of reasons. I wanted to come up with a name that invoked, Afrofuturism speaks by its name to the future, but I wanted something that illustrated an attempt to connect the past and the future. So Imhotep-Hop was the first, Imhotep was the first recorded multi-genius in the history of humanity. He was the architect who devised the step pyramid, which is the first great stone structure in the history of the world. It looks like a staircase. It's, I don't know, 20, 30 stories tall. It's an absolutely magnificent building in Egypt. If you ever get a chance to visit it, you should see it. He was a medical doctor. He was a poet. He was the Grand Vizier, kind of like the Prime Minister of Egypt, or Kemet, the Black Land. So an absolutely phenomenal figure who embodied intellectualism. And the hot part is obvious, is with hip-hop and cyberpunk, I wanted something that would communicate the past and our present and point to the future. All right. And that's, oh, there we go. So one of the key figures for the Afrocentric reclamation of Egypt, a society that up until the 18th century certainly was regarded in Europe as an African civilization, and then got rewritten or remixed to be the Egypt that you see in Hollywood movies, in which all of the ruling elites of Egypt were portrayed by Euro-American actors, and in which only people in chains or dragging heavy bricks were portrayed as Africans. So Cheikh Anta Diop, the Senegalese Egyptologist, was the one who had wrote probably one of the key works, maybe the key work in intellectually galvanizing this movement of scholars, The African Origin of Civilization, Myth or Reality, all about establishing through documentary evidence the African character of ancient Egypt. Of course, it was a multicultural society, but the European project had simply written over the African nature of Egypt. Other Europeans came along and wrote some fine works. Black Athena by Martin Bernal, which also makes great use, more use than Diop did, of linguistic evidence. And I interviewed Martin Bernal on this, and I asked him, and this work rocked the academic world about 20 years ago, and I asked him, had you been an African writer, what do you think the influence of this book would have been? And he said he thinks that the book would have been completely ignored. And he said he also had an advantage being a British writer, because he said that Americans are Anglophiles and they will submit to anybody with an English accent. So he said that gave him extra opportunity to get his work heard and seen. Richard Poe, who is a Euro-American writer, who is actually a very hard right-wing writer, nevertheless wrote his book Black Spark, White Fire. I interviewed him as well. And his book is much more of a popular edition of Black Athena, but highly readable, and it's the exact same thesis. And so it's interesting to see that an author who is certainly associated with the left and another who's associated with the right say, yes, this is what the evidence leads us to. It's quite clear the ancient Egyptians were Africans. And just as Europeans understandably draw upon Greece and Rome as a cultural launch point to understand their histories, even though that it's an overstatement, but it is one of the ways that they have traditionally looked at their history. It is their motherland, civilizationally. Africans, as Cheikh Anta Diop argued, must look to the Kushite civilizations, including especially Egypt and Sudan, in order to understand their civilizations. Part of my project in Imhotep-Hop is I love to work in allegory. And those of you who are literature students, presumably you have long been encouraged to look for what are the references to Shakespeare in whatever novel you're reading. What are the references to Milton? What are the references to Marlowe? And on it goes. And lots of biblical references. Well, for those of us who are Afrocentric writers, one of the problems is that there's nobody teaching a series of foundational texts so that we can make the kinds of allegories and allusions that we need to if we're going to discuss the past while we're discussing the present and the future. So if I were to point to 3 texts that I would say people should know, of any background, but certainly global Africans, the story that I call The Passion of Lord Wusa, Wusa being a more Egyptian version of the Greek name Osiris, his wife Aset, who you might know as Isis, and their son Haru, whom you may know as Horus. This origin story, of brother murdering brother and son avenging father against uncle, gives you Hamlet. Brother against brother gives you thousands of years, this story before Genesis is written, gives you Cain and Abel, and on it goes. So it's a foundational story not only for African literature, but for literature and religious stories of various traditions around the world. Also, I think producing a great feminist hero of Aset, who's this Avenger, and who I explore much more in my book, The Alchemist of Kush, and I'll tell you about that later. The Instructions of Imhotep, argued as the world's first book, an ethical text that goes back, close to 4,500 years, I believe, perhaps older. And actually, I could go this way. You'll see on the left is Haru, the falcon, and on the right is Yinapu, or Anubis, you may know, the embalmer. This is one of the more recent translations, and the title changes depending on who's doing it, but usually it's called The Instructions of Imhotep. And then finally, another very important text from Egypt's Middle Kingdom, a time when people had a very strong memory of Egypt having emerged from terrible collapse. The country had been invaded, had fallen apart, civil war, and the writer writes a magnificent poem about what it is like to be in a country that has fallen apart. And anybody who's lived in South Africa under apartheid, Ireland under British occupation, in Kashmir, Palestine, in Tibet, any place of great conflict, but especially occupation, should be able to recognize themselves in this story about brother killing brother, about people losing faith in all their virtues. It's a magnificent story. So throughout my work, I take these things and then I place them into the stories. When I began to discover those, because people didn't know these texts, I had to be more forthright in terms of getting people first to learn these things so that they could understand the references to them. And so, in some cases, in the case of, for instance, this book, The Alchemist of Kush, is the story of two child soldiers, two Sudanese child soldiers. One of them is, both of them lost their fathers in the Civil War, both of them lost their mothers on the Trail of Tears, both of them had to become violent in order to survive, and both of them won mentors who would turn them into leaders. Now, one of those boys lives in downtown, in Kush in Edmonton today, and the other is Haru, son of Wusser and Aset, who lived 7,000 years ago along the Nile. So there are two interlocking stories, one in the past, one now, and as a result of that, I'm able to show people who've never read this story of the Passion of Wusser, the contendings of Set and Haru, and they could read that story and then see, well, how does it play out in modern terms? So a little bit about my work. So I told you about just about the Alchemist of Kush, different covers obviously. The Coyote King is the space age bachelor pad, which again set in Edmonton, just like half the story of the Alchemist of Kush. The Coyote Kings of the Space Age Bachelor Pad I began as a screenplay in 1995. I turned it into a novel in 2001, got published by Del Rey in 2004. And it's the story of two young guys. This story takes place in 1995. They are long before people were writing putting a lot of writing stories in which characters talked about science fiction and fantasy. This is common now. But I was doing this in 1995 when mostly, other than the movie Clerks, and I think very few people had attempted to do this. And I was having African-Canadian characters do that. So certainly nobody was doing that, and now this has kind of gone mainstream of having people, you've got the Big Bang Theory. A show like that would have been inconceivable in 1995. So I have young African-Canadians as well as this Ethiopian woman named Sharon, who are at the heart of a story that is partly it's this ancient Egyptian story, but it's also about pop culture. It's about friendship. It's about masculinity in large measure, and it's about sacrifice, including whom you will sacrifice to get what you want. Some of my other books include Shrinking the Heroes, which won the Kindred Award. Shrinking the Heroes is a self-help book for superheroes. So it's a book within a book in which a celebrity superhero psychologist takes on the world's mightiest super team, the Fantastic Order of Justice. Six of their heroes are causing so much conflict in terms of office politics that they've been threatened with termination unless they go to group therapy. So this is that story, and it gives me the chance to talk a great deal about the culture of celebrity, problems of psychoanalysis, as well as power and domination. It's also, like a lot of my work, is a very funny book. War and Beer, this is book one, is, you could call it Star Wars meets the Grapes of Wrath. If you follow all the politics of global mobilization, such as the Battle of Seattle in Quebec City and Genoa and so forth. It's those stories. And my short story collection, E-Force. So as I mentioned, my work's allegorical, it's illusory. I think we need allegory because most people won't read history. But if you can give people stories that help them understand the past, they can see how they connect to it, and they don't feel so alone anymore. And they can also see that their struggles are connected with other people's struggles, and you only get justice by working with other people. You can't do it by yourself. Some recent movies may show that one man can pick up a gun and allegedly fight an entire institution of enslavement, but really it's just a rugged individualist getting something for himself and leaving everybody else behind. Also, I deal with religious and mythic and literary allegories, as I've mentioned. I told you about that with Coyote Kings, and with Coyote Kings also dealing in large measure the story is about the international drug trade. In The Alchemist of Kush, the stories that I told you